what would it mean to build a, sort of a threat intelligence team? What would it mean to build a 24-hour-a-day operations center, security operations center that's monitoring the White House network, which seems obvious now. But at the time was like, this wasn't a big concept.
My guest today is Tim Van Name, a former NSA engineer, White House cybersecurity leader, and now president of Orbis Operations. Tim has spent his career inside some of the most consequential national security environments in the world, helping respond to major cyber compromises, modernize government systems, and rethink how America defends itself in an era of AI, autonomous systems, and instant digital conflict.
I think today, as we think about some of these asymmetric threats, these autonomous systems, things that can be emplaced ahead of time, cyber capabilities, like it can be pretty instantaneous. And so our ability to understand, decide, and act, right, we have to compress that period.
This conversation goes beyond cybersecurity. We talk about the collapse of traditional timelines in warfare, the risks of bureaucratic stagnation, and why America's long-term advantage may depend less on technology itself and more on collaboration, ethics, and innovation.
I don't believe that we have a capacity problem. I just believe we have an incentive problem.
And now, here's Tim Van Name. So Tim, we don't do a big intro. We just start talking. And so We're just going to start talking. And the way we're going to start that is by you telling us who you are.
I'm Tim Van Name. I'm currently the president of Orbis Operations, a firm here in Washington, D.C. that specializes in open source intelligence, data fusion, and strategic consulting here in the U.S. and around the world.
And you're in the private sector now, but you have a career spanning mostly on the public side up until about, 2022?
Yeah, that's right, until 2022. Yeah, I started at the National Security Agency. I got to work at the White House for a while. I worked in the Pentagon, in the Defense Digital Service for a while. And then I got to finish my time in the government working for Army Special Operations Command, which was as much of a privilege as it sounds like.
Yeah, we're going to spend some time on that because, well, as much as you can tell us.
Sure.
I want to talk about that for sure. How have you found the transition? How have you found life in the private sector compared to life on the public side?
I think it's one of those things that's like a wave, right? Some days I really love it. And there's days I find myself missing. Yeah. It's such an incredible privilege, right? To get to serve as a part of the government, to get to work with amazing people, to work on these missions that, that really matter and that they impact, national security events and sort of history over time. But there's things about working in the private sector that are just fantastic, like not having to jump through acquisition processes. Yeah. If I want a piece of technology like today with artificial intelligence, I just buy it and we can use it and we can apply impact like tomorrow. And there's a real part of me that just loves getting after problem solving. And so I find that to be really fantastic in the private sector. I also find hiring to be a lot better. In the government, you're oftentimes convincing incredible people to take lower compensation than they deserve to serve the American people. Yeah. And we make that case often. And I really enjoyed, finding talent willing to do that. But it's pretty great in the private sector to be able to pay them what they're worth and to incentivize them to drive outcomes.
We talk about that a lot. So we have a lot of people on the Watchers who have spent career in leadership inside the government. And there's a couple themes or theses that as we approach 50 episodes of the Watchers.
Congrats on that.
Thank you. It's been pretty wild that we're that close. But one of the theses that shines through is always that the people who work in government are mission driven. I mean, we're painting with a broad stroke. Don't get me wrong. I'm sure there are people who don't, you know what I mean, right? But so many of the people that we talk to are highly talented and could, if they were only financially motivated, and would, if they were only financially motivated, work in the private sector. And the fact that they choose to serve in the public sector tells you what their motivations are, right? And people seem to forget that the talented people in government, in these institutions, care about the mission first and foremost. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there. Yeah. And I think that's super interesting to have had that experience and having to sell talented people on that versus, in the private sector, you can still sell them on mission, but you can also sell them on hey, the private sector pays pretty nicely. And that's a good point about sort of the freedom and the flexibility. We sometimes are asked in our business, we don't actually do any defense contracting ourselves. We just sort of support contractors. And occasionally people ask if we want to get involved in that. I won't say no. I won't say no, never. But I will say I really like when I can talk to another business and I can send them a proposal and they can sign it the same day.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to go out to 3 others, depending on the size of the business. If they want to do business with you, if you've built a good relationship, you can just start.
Right.
And there's no hoops to jump through. So I'm totally with you there. I could see that being, a big relief. But then all the challenges that come with private sector too, as we were talking about hiring, being its own challenge, getting the right team around you being its own challenge. Well, I want to take this back. I want to start with you and the start of your professional career in the NSA.
Yeah.
Tell me what took you there. How'd you end up at the NSA?
Yeah, I think I think folks in my generation all probably have a pretty similar story here, which is like 9/11 impacted me pretty deeply. How
old were you?
I was in 6th grade at the time, so I was probably 11.
7th grade.
Right on. Okay. And yeah, I had an uncle who was in I thought the first tower that got hit ended up being the second tower that got hit. He had moved offices the day before, sort of unbeknownst to the family. And so we thought for a couple of days that he had died. And it impacted sort of an 11-year-old me. I felt this calling to service from that point forward. Thought I would join the military. I think my father sat me down when I was about 18 and astutely pointed out that I probably wasn't great at rules then, probably not great at rules now, like to find the gray and sort of tread through that. And that, he encouraged me to find other ways to serve. And so I applied, went to school in California College in California, applied to every intelligence agency as many times as I could. And finally one called me back.
What'd you study in college?
I was a biomedical engineer.
Biomedical engineer. Into the NSA. How does that happen?
Yeah, I was a biomedical engineer. I was really interested at the time in sort of microelectronics. I thought that might have some applicability. I was also interested in things like physical therapy and sort of healing people. I wasn't totally sure the direction of my life was going to take. But when I started talking to an NSA recruiter at the time, they were putting together these development programs, and they wanted engineers from a variety of different backgrounds.
Smart.
Because in their mind, they wanted people who had been taught rigorous problem solving and the methodologies you use for that, but who come at it from different approaches. And folks who are thinking about things like biocompatibility, or we had some like environmental scientists who are thinking about things like materials and how those break down over time. And so they put together a group of engineers from a wide variety of backgrounds, and they actually sent us to grad school together to learn even more. But it was an incredible opportunity. And at the time, I probably couldn't have even told you what the National Security Agency did. I lived 3,000 miles away. I was pretty focused on surfing. It was very important to me at the time. But I looked back and, just sort of leaped without looking, moved across the country, knew nobody on the East Coast. My boss at NSA picked me up at the airport because I just didn't know what I was doing. Best experience I ever had. I was so glad I joined it. And once I figured out what the job was, once they actually told me about the position, it was amazing. We were focused on hard problems, working with really interesting engineers spanning, sort of like generations. And it was a lot of fun.
I think that's a really wise approach from the NSA's standpoint, right? To go find what we would call like non-traditional, I guess, sort of, find people with different experiences, diversity of experience, but sort of the common thread there, creative problem solving. There's so many applications for that. And then, I think probably the same as you, I don't know when I became aware of the NSA, but for a long time, if you had asked me, what is the NSA? What do they do? I would have no idea. Unfortunately, they became in the limelight around the, Edward Snowden case. It was kind of the first thing that really put it in the American zeitgeist. But I've since, literally just in the 2 years I've been doing the podcast, I've had so many people from the NSA on, and I've learned so much about the mission and about the type of people and about the things that we're doing. Here, someone with a biomedical engineering background. I've obviously talked to computer engineers. I've talked to leadership experts, military officers who've all kind of gone down that, and just a diverse group of people on a really cool mission, and one that unfortunately has been overshadowed by some of the bad of the NSA, or not the bad of the NSA, but the bad of the story, right? That comes out with things like Edward Snowden. Were you there when that happened? I
was. Yeah, I just started when all of that was ongoing, and Yeah, I got signed up because I'd just been a college graduate. I got signed up for recruiting, I think like sort of 2 or 3 weeks after it broke, and that was an adventure. I was at a school in California. Student population similarly, right? Sort of the story had broke, bunch of misinformation that's out there. I mean, I think one of the really fantastic things about the National Security Agency, right, is it's a lot of sort of keep your head down, do work, right? Like it's clear what the job is, which is protecting our critical systems. And I'm sure we'll talk more about sort of cybersecurity and the importance of that, but also this foreign intelligence mission. But sort of keep your head down, don't focus on what the press is saying about it. But you get to school and you got some angry college students who have a lot to say. And it's funny, actually, one of the people I recruited at the time works for me now. He's our CTO. It's the third time I've hired him. I still think he's as fantastic as the first time I hired him. But it was interesting because he was one of those like sort of frustrated. He had really hard questions. And I walked away from that saying, we should talk about this more. We should go and have more conversations because what we do is really, really important. The other thing I would share and just maybe bring up that I thought was so interesting about NSA at the time, but was also a thing, like a focus of recruiting, was NSA has a really neurodivergent population. A huge portion of the workforce self-identifies or is identified through a doctor. And so you talked about diversity. And NSA is one of the most diverse places I've ever worked. And that was true in every mission team I worked on. It was also true in the recruiting team. And I think that's something that's really, really cool. Like for many people, certainly for me, I knew nothing about it, right? Like I sort of had this idea in my head of like James Bond, and like instead it's a bunch of amazingly talented, smart people who come from a wide variety of backgrounds and apply those skills to stuff. We certainly have some of those, but that's not what everyone is.
Sure. Yeah. No, when you think of the NSA or any large like 3-letter agency, it's easy to sort of depict in your head suits, right? Yeah. Just like government suits, bureaucratic. And then you actually talk to people about their experience and you find out like for a lot of them it's a very creative, progressive environment, very open and like diverse, right? And you just assume everyone's just like a high and tight military fade type institution. You find out some of like the most radical punk rock people actually worked in those institutions.
Right.
Same with like the CIA and the intelligence agencies as well. Some of the people I've met where I'm like, wait, you spent a career at the CIA and you're like covered in tats. You know who I'm talking about?
I know exactly who you're talking about. Yeah, Johnny Gannon. Yeah.
Doesn't seem like someone if you met in the wild you wouldn't associate that with your mental image of what the CIA is, but once you get to know people, it makes so much more sense why the population that serves those missions is like that. You want creative problem solvers in your national security agency. You want people who are looking at novel challenges at that sort of scale and that level of complexity and that level of importance and severity. You want some out-of-the-box thinkers, and you want as many different opinions to come in and help solve that problem that you can.
Yeah, that's right.
So that had to be a very cool environment for somebody coming right out of college. Is that like your first professional experience?
Yeah, I mean, while I was waiting for my clearance to come through, my like senior project in college ended up turning into a consulting experience. It was great. I worked for some really neat people, some machinists, and learned a ton about like a totally different aspect of engineering. My first like real job. That was like could have been a career. And so I loved it. Cannot recommend it, enough to folks who are interested in wickedly hard problems and working with smart people to solve them that has a material impact on the U.S. and the world. I loved every minute of it.
What can you talk about your time at the NSA? Like what kind of work were you working on?
So as part of a development program, it's a neat thing that the National Security Agency has where you get to do 6 different jobs over a 3-year period. And so you move around a lot. I got to do, a whole mixture of things, everything from like working inside of tailored access operations, which is the group of hackers that do really interesting things, to I worked inside of the like front office of the shop that deployed resources on the ways that we were going to collect intelligence over time. So I did a bunch of like math. And then got to be exposed to things like cryptography, got to be exposed to, all of the ways we do collection around the world. And I loved each of those functions. But the one where, I think I sort of felt the most gravity and actually thought where I was going to spend most of my career was inside of tailored access operations, sort of doing the work that they do. I guess that's now called computer network operations. So they've named themselves exactly what they do, which is helpful. Ended up, sort of moving from there to the White House almost unexpectedly. And so I saw myself in my first few years working at NSA, like I thought that was going to be a 30-year career. I thought that's what I was going to do forever. And then the opportunity presented itself, and it was time to move on.
So tell me about that. Tell me about that opportunity and how you ended up over at the White House.
Yeah, it was. I thought it was really interesting. It was one of those jobs you could sort of apply for. Was exploring that, having conversations about it, and then
what was the job?
It was one of those sort of development program positions at the White House. I had applied for it, and then in 2014, has been publicly reported, the White House was compromised along with a number of other government agencies, and I think they just sort of went through the list of people who had applied and grabbed some folks with relevant experiences. I got pulled to the White House and asked
in a time of crisis.
Yeah, that's right. And
okay.
So I got to work with some incredible people and really think about both how do we deal with this compromise, how do you clean up the network, but also what would it look like to redesign the way that the White House approaches technology, to think about that in a significantly more secure way, but also to modernize the use of technology. Yeah. So at the time, we were using, we're still using BlackBerries, and everybody right in their other pocket.
Obama was the first one to get a BlackBerry, right? Isn't that sort of the thing?
I may have been true with the BlackBerry. I actually don't know before my time, but he was definitely the first person to get an iPhone.
Yeah.
And that's what we did when we were there, was like migrate over to smartphones. Move to a place where mobility was really a part of the way the White House operated, and think about how do you set this up to work for the next 10 years. And so really, sort of out of crisis comes opportunity.
Yeah.
And I also believe deeply from my time in government, you should never waste a crisis. And so White House, Congress, State Department, others were compromised. I'm like, let's go have a real conversation about how we change this.
2014, right? Yeah. And that's also, as I think back, so I've spent my career in the private sector. And I started as like a computer hobbyist, and that sort of turned into a career. In 2014, that time frame was fairly transformative in IT anyway. There was a lot happening around. Virtualization was very much well on its way, but that was still happening. Mm-hmm. This whole shift to the cloud was still happening. The mobility, everything was changing very rapidly. And then to go into an environment like that, high stakes, responding to an incident, dealing with a crisis, and trying to do that transformation would probably at the time be stressful, but I'm sure was exciting and interesting.
Yeah, it was. I think the adrenaline is still working its way out of my system. Right? Like it was such a high at the time.
Heart rate's still elevated.
And it was. I think I would have been sort of defeating, right, if I'd been there at the time of the compromise. But I knew going in that had already happened, and so. It was somewhat invigorating, the idea of like, we can start over. We can think about things like virtualization, right? We can think about what would it mean to build a sort of a threat intelligence team? What would it mean to build a 24-hour-a-day operations center, security operations center that's monitoring the White House network, which seems obvious now.
Right.
But at the time was like, this wasn't a big concept that I think had been deployed to, across the government and even across the private sector. And so I found it to be invigorating. You get to work at the White House, you're walking these hollowed halls, you're working with incredibly smart and capable people, but also the sort of can-do mentality of, I think there's lots of things that get politicized. Like really, fortunately, in my time, I've not really found cybersecurity to be a politicized issue. So when we went and said we need a bunch more money to clean this up and do it right, Congress was like, yeah, and OMB was like, yeah, sure, let's do that. We went back and we said, like, actually, we need to move money from this pier to here, and we want to do this differently, and we're going to adopt some new technologies. They were like, yeah, sort of makes sense. Doesn't mean there wasn't a bunch of explaining and conversations, but. If I look back at from 50,000 feet, for the most part, everyone we talked to at the time was like, yeah, do the right thing. Help me understand why that's the right thing. Let me ask you some questions. Maybe we'll tweak it a little bit, but directionally, we all agree we should do that.
Yeah, there's thankfully no party lines being drawn around cybersecurity. There's sort of two edges to that, in that it's good that it's not politicized, right? Because when you need it, whoever you're talking to can give it to you. But at the same time, it's not a political winner too, right? The investment in cybersecurity. And one of the questions I was going to ask is the mode or the life cycle of cybersecurity seems to be close budget, incident, open, wallet. Yes. And then we come all the way, close budget, incident, right? What does it say about us that, it takes a crisis to create the advantage to deal with it?
I think it's unfortunate that it takes a crisis, but I also think these things are hard, right? Especially if, I'm got to work with folks in the Office of Management and Budget, right, that like puts forward the budget proposal. I got to work with appropriators in Congress. And I mean, they're looking across these just massive, staggering numbers. And I think, right, we've only really seen the spend on cybersecurity go up over time. I don't think the slope of that line is as aggressive as it should have been, and still don't really think it is. But I appreciate it's incredibly hard, right? Like we're in a massive budget deficit. And almost everything that we're talking about is additive. And it's also tremendously challenging to quantify the negative, right? It's like, well, I think we should spend 15% more on cybersecurity. And they're like, all right, well, how sure if you don't that you'll be compromised? No one has that data, right? That's not me saying we shouldn't spend the money. Like I still, every time I have the opportunity to talk to those folks, right, advocating for more, I actually think we should think about cybersecurity as a percentage of total IT spend. Maybe we should adjust that percentage or increase it over time. But actually, one of the things that I see is quite scary is oftentimes we'll do a significant IT investment, and we're seeing a bunch of those take place across the Department of War today, but not a commensurate increase in the cybersecurity associated with. And I think that is really potentially problematic. It's that if I were to pin a controversial statement, the most important thing we could do is directly increase that.
So listen, controversy, we're here for it.
All right, great.
So let's pull the thread on this some more, because if we're going to go into controversy, let's do it. So what are some of the current Department of War initiatives where they're spending money on the build out and creating new capability where you're not seeing commensurate investment in the security side? Yeah,
I mean, I think there's a bunch of really interesting ones ongoing right now. There's programs like the Next Generation Command and Control program, where it's incredibly important. The Army changes the way it thinks about warfighting. I think what we've seen in Ukraine, is that the time domain is going to be contested, and we need a more modern approach.
What do you mean time domain?
Yeah, so I think in the era of asymmetric warfare, the most important domain is time. And what I mean by that is the threats are incredible, they're precise, they're immense, and they're quite cost effective now. And I think before you could think about sort of like a line of tanks or a line of troops approaching you, and like you could quantify that, the amount of time it would take for those tanks to get from where they are to where you are. I think today, as we think about some of these asymmetric threats, these autonomous systems, things that can be emplaced ahead of time, cyber capabilities, like it can be pretty instantaneous. And so our ability to understand, decide, and act, right, we have to compress that period. And I think that's true in the military context, which I've just described, but I actually think that's equally true for the private sector, right? Where these ransomware attacks and these cyber attacks, like you've got moments. And my concern is that if we're not making the investment in cybersecurity, so things like next generation command and control, I'm thinking a lot about the next generation of aircraft that are being invested and coming out. And, I think this is actually one of those spaces where we also shouldn't let people check their own homework. Like cybersecurity, in my mind, is best done by an additional party, and not doesn't mean we shouldn't think about defense in depth. Folks who are building it should be required to invest and to think about, but we need someone else checking the math on that. And I think there's some really good things that are taking place towards the private sector. I'd like to see more of that applied inside of the departments and agencies across the government as well.
Do you see the investment in the time domain? It's the first time I've heard of that. And that makes a ton of sense, right? That is a increasingly important factor. Because to your point, the less kinetic things seem to be, or the less like traditionally kinetic, like we know how much fuel they have, so we know how much of their fleet they can move here, there, everywhere. But as things like drones are coming online, that's really reducing the cost to create a kinetic impact. And then the entirety of the cyber domain, and the fact that a foreign adversary can have a kinetic impact here right now at the speed of packets, that does seem increasingly important that we're aware of that. Do you see that being baked into the strategy? Are we thinking about the time domain as something that needs to be addressed?
Yeah, I definitely hear senior leaders talk about it, right, as something that we need to do. I think it's a space where it's really hard to do well, and there needs to be some focused efforts to make that real. And I think there's places like autonomy, right, where I could point to the Department of War is doing I think a pretty fantastic job across the board of thinking about drone dominance. And I think on the other side of the coin, there's like an entire group of people who are really thinking about how do we counter autonomous systems on the other side. But what I don't see a fantastic job of yet is the sort of integrated effects. I'm really worried about a world where we're facing a hypersonic missile, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, a drone swarm, a cyber attack, all at the same time.
Right.
And I think today, almost all of the coordination that takes place is done at the human level across the entities responsible for those things. And, we've talked about things like joint all-domain command and control for a while, but it's still not clear to me we could actually understand and react to that threat in the short period of time you'd have to handle it.
It feels a little Skynet, right? We're really these days. We are really talking about autonomous fleets of essentially robots, and we're offloading decision making to autonomous fleets of robots who are going to try to establish dominance over each other, right? And this really feels like, hey, if you ramp this thing up to a point where we're really going into a total arms race and the volume of it gets so high, it's hard not to think that's kind of scary.
Yeah, I think it is kind of scary. I think the hope, right, is that like America has done pretty successfully for the last 50 years, is that we'll advance our offensive and defensive capabilities faster than anyone else, and we will use that as a global superpower to be a deterrent. But I do think as the cost gets lower, both for cyber attacks and for some of these autonomous kinetic solutions, like I think we've gotten to a place where this is not only a nation state level capability, and so I think we need to think about it differently. And we need to move out on, in particular, our ability to defend against these threats, to advance that as quickly as possible.
Here are two cybersecurity practitioners who are of course going to say like how important this is.
Yeah.
Right. I'm sure we're biased at some level. But every facet of society, like my wife is not involved in my work at all. Knows nothing about it. And by design, we keep it out of our personal life. She's not a Luddite necessarily, but she's like just not connected to technology beyond the use of her iPhone and just uses whatever sort of Apple features they provide. But it's such a huge part of her life.
Yeah.
Everybody's life is so integrated with the technology in their pocket.
Yeah.
And then like every activity that you want to schedule, everything you want to do, we want to get groceries, like everything about our life has really become so technologically driven, let alone all of the economy is entirely at this point underpinned by technology and is only getting further entrenched. Like if you're not modernizing or adopting new technology like AI, you're falling behind already. And more we're creating this dependence on it. It doesn't, to your point, doesn't feel like we're being commensurate in our investment in thinking about and securing that, right? We're creating more attack surface every day and it's compounding significantly. And I don't see, as a cybersecurity professional, I do not see the awareness of how much we're increasing the attack surface and the action to deal with that. That increasingly has me concerned because of, again, how much of our economy and our society is now underpinned by technology, and like every day, compromises doing the same thing they've been doing for the last 20 years. Recent in the news is Canvas, like tons of school systems offline because this was compromised, and Stryker got compromised through like a least privileged sort of problem where we've had the engineering solution to this for so long, but the cost to implement and the overhead and all that and the burden, I think it's just like we're just not connecting how important it is to actually making sure it's still available and has integrity and our data is confidential. Like we're just still not wrapping our heads around it.
Yeah.
I don't know. Is that just like a vague problem statement?
No. I mean, I think it is a problem. I also think often my grandmother has an iPad, right? And she amazes me. She drives it. She's incredibly effective at using it. We get awesome text messages and statements to cheer us up, which like is meaningful and important. But she says often like it's just getting so complex for her to use, right? And like we've pushed, I think, as technologists, right? We're sure we come from the cybersecurity side, right? But as technologists, like we've pushed a ton of the burden onto users around cybersecurity.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I think there's a clarion call in my mind that needs to be rung that says we really have an obligation to users who we shouldn't expect to understand all of the nuances of the attack surface. That's what practitioners are for. But we need to figure out a way to take the burden from consumers and from small companies and move that to a place where technology providers are onboarding some of that risk. Unfortunately, I think in the US, a lot of that just has to do with financial liability.
Yeah.
We've allowed users to sign these end user license agreements that fully absolve companies. Like if we change that paradigm, I don't believe that we have a capacity problem. I just believe we have an incentive problem.
Yeah, no, I think you're dead on there, right? And the shift left is something that needs to happen in so many different areas. It strikes me that this point in time, as a blue teamer, I've been a career blue teamer. Red team sounds fun, but I've always been on defense. Funny, most of the sports I played defense too. I wonder if there's something to that.
Interesting.
But as a defender, like we have better tools than ever. The tools that we can now deploy to endpoints, the EDR solutions, the SOC capability, things like application control tools, everything's gotten so rich and capable. So it's like easier than it's ever been, but it's also harder than it's ever been. And I think I probably, if I had to pick a statement, I'd say it's harder than ever to be a defender because the attack complexity and capability and sophistication is happening so fast. They're iterating so fast. Every time we see some sort of compromise and we see something novel, it's like, damn, that was so creative.
Yeah.
Right. And their tooling is getting so capable. And now you add things like AI to the mix. There's so much to try to keep your hands on as a defender. There's so much field to try to control. And like you literally can't. That's why we have risk management methodologies to try to quantify and qualify the risks to make decisions of where to invest money. But we're opening up like new fronts all the time. And we're just like, I feel like we're further on our back feet. Like we're just getting pushed further and further off the table because like there's just so much volume of stuff coming in. It's a really challenging time to play defense.
Yeah. I think that's true. I was actually really excited to see Anthropic put out Glasswing and say AI is changing the way that attack and defense is happening, but we're going to release the defensive capability first. It's the first time I could concretely point to a company saying like, it's time we advantage the defenders. Right, the attackers will get theirs too, but like it's time we advantage the defenders. I thought that was really interesting, and I actually love to see more companies take a proactive approach like that. It's not not pointing to them specifically. It's just one where like it made a national news because Glasswing was so capable, and I've played around with it. It's really interesting from a defense perspective. It's incredibly capable, but at the same time, it's like I see the other side of that coin. I'm certainly worried about how much AI is advantaging attackers, especially when we have such a fractured, as you said, the attack surface is now just so big. I'm not sure anyone understands it. The last thing that I think is quite unfortunate is that we've made it so hard to talk about cybersecurity that for most decision makers, and I think this is true inside of government and outside of government, that we sort of reduce cybersecurity decisions to like talking points. Like, oh, you've got like this particular, like, oh yeah, it's a moderate risk. And you're like, I've just reduced a really complex risk decision down to sort of one thing. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. There's lots of things we reduce down, but I do think it's one of those places where risk compounds over time. And so I accept a bunch of moderate risk decisions over an extended period, and I never go back and revisit the holistic picture. Is that aggregate risk? Is that sort of mosaic risk? Just like catastrophic? And I didn't understand. I think that's what you saw. I mean, some of the compromises you mentioned with places like Stryker, right? It's just like this normalization of deviance around risk, and that compounded over time to a point where it's
I can imagine the conversations that it's always the like little things, right? We'll do it this way, and then you don't follow up on the decision, and like slowly that just grows and grows, and then all of a sudden you've got an exposure, a very simple one that can take your whole company down. And you talk about risk as a practitioner. I've been doing IT and cybersecurity getting close to 20 years. I've still really struggled to wrap my head around how to have a good risk conversation because it's quantifiable, But almost always when I quantify risk, can we call it what it is? It's BS.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, we're pulling stuff out. It could cost us this much. We don't know. We have a rough sense. Like I could quantify, if your revenue is this much and we impacted you and we took you down for 2 weeks and you would normally make this. I get that, but it's still just hard to quantify and make that, feel real in a conversation. And as you were talking, I was just thinking like my LinkedIn feed, as cybersecurity driven as it is, the majority of it's about like communication. I just see a lot of people that want to comment on like, well, this is how you should talk to your board and this is how you should relay it. And here's how you communicate and make it simple and pretty graphics and all that sort of stuff. Which, kind of seems to, miss the point to oversimplify it. I think that made sense for the time, think of like the 2010s, the first time I had to brief a board, like, yeah, I really had to simplify it because these were not IT cybersecurity people. I guess my point there is kind of like, that's not an excuse anymore. Like we have to all be literate about this in the same way. I don't think you would put someone on your board who didn't understand basic finances, like who didn't understand what a P&L is.
Right.
I think increasingly the board should not be composed of people who don't understand roughly how the internet works and what attack surface is.
Right.
Like explain that as a concept. I don't know that I have a point there other than I'm waxing to somebody who knows the struggle.
Yeah, well, I think there's two things that strike me as you say that, and I think that's actually a really interesting point about sort of we expect them to understand P&L, but we don't expect them to understand attack surface, and like the risk here is significant. But I had a conversation recently with a leader in the Middle East who said, incredibly technically literate, but on top of that, really driving leaders across government and industry in the country to be increasingly literate. Because in his mind, the digital economy will drive whether or not a nation is successful into the future. And
100%.
It just like stuck with me. And what I found was interesting as I met with a number of sort of senior leaders of industry across that country was like it clearly had translated. There are some of them, right? They're using the words, they don't understand the concepts yet, but they're trying. And like, in my mind, if I were to sort of reduce the American spirit to one thing, it's like the belief that we can always do better. This is a place where we should try. I think the second thing that really stood out for me is I had two amazing, technical professionals who worked for me when I was at the White House, Casey and RJ. And, they were doing those spreadsheets, as you said, just BS out the wazoo, right? 900 rows of nonsense. And they came back and they said, I'm accepting a bunch of risk here, right? Like, how should we be thinking about this? And they're like, there's really only like 14 questions we need the answer to. Oh, I like that better. Like, keep talking. I'm interested. Yeah. And it was basically the questions you should ask of the folks who are building the system, right? What's your approach to security, right? How'd you think about this, right? Walk me through the steps of this. And obviously it's much more intelligent than what I just described, but like really a thoughtful set of questions that you could have as a conversation with the people who are building the system. And importantly, what they were trying to signal to me was you could start the conversation earlier. So as they're building the system, like go in and have these conversations, right? Like, let's talk about how you're planning to do this and we'll give you some feedback now. And then on the other side, right? Like no plan survives first contact. So on the other side, like let's talk about how that shifted and why and what we're going to do about it to mitigate that risk. But it really stuck with me. I've sort of beat the drum on that for a while. Like this 14 intelligent questions is a much better way to talk about risk. It didn't mean that I didn't need to understand the risk I was accepting, but what I was not expected to do any longer was go through 1,000-row spreadsheet in like infinitesimal details. And I'm not knocking that. Like, things like the risk management framework, they exist because we're trying to figure out how to do risk interoperability across the complex system like the government. But I'm just not convinced that something that worked at the time still works now. And I think, unfortunately, what I see occurring is because it's so hard to move to something new, because it takes so long. I mean, like today, I think the average time in the government for a authority to operate the sort of risk acceptance decision that a government makes is something like 12 plus months. And so what we do is we keep using the old, broken, potentially compromised technology as we wait for the new thing to come along.
So we care more about following the bureaucratic process than achieving the outcome. I was going to make sort of a quip, which is like, I'm skeptical that the risk heat map is informing anybody anything useful at all anymore. Like, did it ever? I mean, because I've done heat maps for a long time. Yeah. That was like the first cute trick you learn when you're a cybersecurity person that has to brief non-cybersecurity people. You create that. It's impressive. Look how many dots we have in the red, guys. We need money.
Right.
But I don't know that that's helping anybody anymore. It's society needs, like, I get philosophical on this shows
let's do it.
And I talk about society and sort of like the impact there. And you and I are both in leadership positions at companies. Yeah. You brought up Anthropic, and you brought up Anthropic's positioning on how they release something into the wild that helps the defenders, and they're really holding off on their offensive capability. As far as I know, Mythos is still like mythical in nature.
Sure.
It's this thing we keep hearing about. It's not actually out, and we don't really see what it's doing. And they seem to be, I'm so cynical sometimes, but they seem to be morally driven. And I'm finding our generation of leadership does seem to have this through line of like idealism that I really think is arriving at the right time. I've been so frustrated in my career seeing, not just my career, because I've worked at some really good places, but like in my life, in my adult life, paying attention to the private sector, seeing the profit at all costs, like driving factor behind everything, and now running a company where obviously we want to be profitable, but regularly I make a decision where I'm like, yeah, we're going to lose money on that, or like that's maybe not the wisest spend, but it's the right thing. Yeah. More and more I see some hope in that. And I think it is like, as we're evolving into this new digital age, we really need entities like companies to make the right decision and be morally driven, not just like fiduciary driven. Mm-hmm. And that's a societal sort of challenge we have. Because when it really boils down to it, everyone who's ever talked to a board knows that the last question that they always sort of like land on is financial in nature. Yeah. They'll buy into you. They'll say like, that was a great talk, great speech, really compelling stuff, but how much is this going to cost me? Right. How are we going to get past this major problem set if we can't like reframe the conversation that way? You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and I love getting philosophical. But I also like, I'm quite optimistic. Like I agree with you as I look at a lot of my contemporaries and partners throughout industry. I do see folks who care about this. I'm excited. I've seen some even private equity companies talk about like double bottom line, right? Like, are we making money and are we doing good? Like I'm really optimistic about where we're headed. But I think a huge amount of that is actually like the accountability of peers, right? I do think there was this sort of race to the bottom line, this like profit at all costs. And I hope we're swinging the other direction, right? Where, folks who are being considered for board positions, they're being asked the question, right? Do you care about what's moral and what's ethical? And, America's, my childhood, I still deeply believe in the country, like lighthouse on the hill, right? We do the right thing because it's the right thing. And if you do the right thing for the right reasons, like you're going to win over time, right? Like, and I hope we're heading that direction. And I am really encouraged and like delighted by this conversation, really encouraged by my peers who I hear saying the same thing, right? Like at the end of the day, I also see myself as an employer. It's really important to me that we create jobs, right? And so like, I'm not pretending like this is not a business, right? Like this is not it's a welfare program, right?
Yeah. It's not at profit at some level.
Totally. But if it's like,
to be at all costs.
Yeah, can we do it the right way for the right reason? And I think I'm seeing more of that.
Yeah, this is where, our generation, as all generations do, we take heat, right?
For sure.
We take heat from the older generation because we're different. We have a different way of doing things. And one of the things that I've heard older generations complain endlessly about our generation is like they want to understand why. We want to understand why. Mm-hmm. And that frustrates them because they're like, well, your paycheck is why you care about the thing I'm doing. And that doesn't work for us. Right. That's a feature, not a bug. Yeah. Especially, again, in this time when we need people who are morally driven, who are mission driven, it's good timing for that in my mind. And I think, I'm like I said, I'm idealistic about it. I'm optimistic about it. I think I see some of the societal levers where what measures success in our generation is going to be less about who dominates financially. Yeah. Right. It's not going to be about who's the biggest, baddest control of your company. It's like, who's going to have the most positive impact on the world. I'm super idealistic to a fault at times. But I often think about, like, what am I trying to do with my company? Obviously, I'm trying to create jobs. We're trying to grow. We're trying to provide a service and whatnot. But I tell people this, and I mean it when I tell our staff this, like, I would rather drive this thing into the ground the right way, like on my terms and like trying to do the right thing, than compromise on my values. Mm-hmm. Maybe that sounds like lip service from the CEO. Great. It is what it is. Thankfully, we're not driving into the ground.
Yeah, it's great.
So hopefully I never have to prove that point. But I feel like life is a long journey. In my business life, I'm going to interact with a lot of people. I may see you down the line. I care a lot more that I can comfortably share space with you and bump into you and we have a good exchange than like these Wall Street like CEOs who have to have a private elevator because they can't face anybody, right? Because they're so mercenary and so soulless. Hopefully more people are motivated that way. And that goes back to like my point. I think companies, as they are becoming centers of power, like Anthropic might be the most powerful company next to NVIDIA right now. You know, there's something up in that sort of space. The more power concentrates with them, the less we want them to be financially concerned. They really have to be concerned because they actually have their hand on the levers of the world. Wow, I'm getting really soapboxy here.
It's good.
But that's how we want them to be motivated because they're in positions that governments historically have been in and are going to be in.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I'm still optimistic, but I do think there's a real responsibility there. And I can wax philosophically on the other side of that, which is like, I think social media has been really a problem. I don't think we've seen a bunch of companies sort of step up there and think about the cosmic good and their responsibility around it. I think we're starting to now see regulations. There were some big wins in Europe in the last few months around holding companies accountable, especially for protecting children. Like I would love to see this next generation of the super unicorns, right? NVIDIA, Anthropic, OpenAI feel like they've got a responsibility to think about sort of that cosmic good. And not saying that everyone's going to get it right, but trying matters.
Yeah, well, it's when you have the resources that you have, like he who has the most resources has the most responsibility to like use them wisely. Yeah. Right. Companies like Anthropic could say, well, we just provide the platform. Like this has been the historic sort of cloud,
like hands off
social media thing ever. Like we just provide the platform. We don't provide the content. We have no responsibility to deal with that. But you're the only ones who can.
Right.
Or the only ones who can have the most positive impact because of the amount of resources you're amassing. This is that like shift left mentality. We have to. Accountable implies they've done something wrong. Like holding people accountable has this like connotation of like, well, you're telling us we did something wrong. It's not that. It's that you have a responsibility. If you're an AI company and you're a generative AI company, you need to be thinking how to control your model in such a way that it can't produce things like CSAM. Yeah. That's just, I'm sorry, you have to deal with that problem. You can't offload that to society and be like, here you go, guys. Here's this terrible tool, and we just trust you to use it wisely and not inappropriately. You can't enjoy. I guess the point is like you can't enjoy all the benefit and suffer none of the cost. Right. You know. That's
right. Yeah. No, I agree, and I genuinely like. I think Glasswing was like that gives me hope. Right. Yeah. It was a real deliberate decision to do the right thing. Yeah, probably. Yeah. I was raised on the sunshine. Yeah. I don't know what to tell you.
Can't take them out of California. I get it. Well, we're on our philosophical soapbox early.
Yeah.
I normally save that for sort of the end here. But let's bring it back down. Let's get back into shop talk.
Okay.
Tell me about Orbis operations and what you're working on.
Yeah. So Orbis operations, we do open source intelligence and we help clients here in the U.S. and around the world to sort of better understand what's happening on the internet. There's an amazing amount of data out there. I think it's increasingly important to understand narratives and trends and to be able to have conversations around things like beneficial ownership and supply chains. And so we help our customers around the world to do that. We have a product called Discovery, pulls it into a AI enhanced workspace, and so that you can interact with that data and draw insights really quickly. what we've been spending, I'd say the preponderance of our time on, and about what about half of our company does now is data fusion. And so we call our product Catalyst. It provides a sovereign operational data layer. And so the idea here is take the information you have from a variety of different sensors, from a variety of different systems, pull that into a distributed data mesh that allows you to access it reliably. So you're not having to do all these point-to-point link connections, but to access it securely. We implemented about 3 years ago Kyber cryptography when it first came out, the new FIPS 140-3 standard. It's supposed to be quantum resistant, so really generating in the commercial national security algorithm space some significant advantages. But most importantly, I think in my mind, what Catalyst affords is the ability to do secure data sharing. So you can provide access, you can provide transport for that data, but you can share it across your organization, between organizations, and hopefully between nations as well. And I see the world moving from a place where the US acted as a hegemon. We sort of showed up, gave our partners devices, told them to use our technology, much more to a world where people want sovereign control of their data. They want the ability to share it. Yeah. I think intelligence sharing is we're at a paramount point in time where we have a conversation about that, like especially today in the era of AI. I think autocracies have an advantage if we all don't work together. And so I'm excited because Catalyst provides a mechanism to do that securely, reliably, and repeatably.
What's your thought on the fact that we do seem to be devolving into sovereign control again, right? Everyone seems to be pulling everything back in.
Yeah, I don't mind sovereign. I think sovereign is great, which is we should have partners who really understand their assets, what they have to share. I'll point to Bretton Woods, which is, I think, one of those sort of seminal. The U.S. stood up and said, hey, we'll provide security, right, if you use our monetary standard. I'd like to do the same thing around data, right? Like, hey, we'll support your sovereign defense if you participate in information sharing with us and in a way that we think is secure and advantages democracy and around the world. And, so what I think is really interesting, right, is like sovereign is not bad, right? But isolationist in my mind is bad, right? I don't mind if people are like, we want to control these, right? We want to understand them. We want to make deliberate decisions about what we share. The U.S. has always done that, right? We have an incredible sensor network around the world, and we choose what partners we share that with and under what circumstances. But I worry about this sort of like everyone's shrinking back into this isolationist stance, and I am concerned, especially as we see, the aggression, I think in sort of 3 regions of the globe right now, right? We're seeing it from Russia, we're seeing it from Iran, and I think we're starting to see China do some saber rattling. Like, it's incredibly important that we work closely with our partners who are threatened. And I think, we've, to your point on the last conversation, like we've got a responsibility and we've got an opportunity to be the partner of choice. And I worry if we don't move now, that won't always be there.
Well, I think one thing that we talk about a lot, you mentioned China. China in particular, they've been the boogeyman, and I get it. Yeah, I'm super skeptical of the boogeyman anytime we paint an entity as the boogeyman. But I've just been really paying attention to them. I've been paying attention to just sort of the moves coming out of China, especially geopolitically, and their technological forward thinking. And I just keep seeing areas where it feels like they're outmaneuvering. Mm-hmm. And one of the things it's very easy to be critical of this about, the States is like, we just have this like quarterly mindset or at best we have like a 4-year election cycle mindset. And that's pervasive. There was a post about the world I'm in, managed service providers. There's a guy who does a lot of like valuations and merger and acquisition stuff. And one of the things that he posted about recently was like timing your acquisition because of the election cycle is like everything's around that. Like you got to make your decision 2 years before because that changes everything. So we have this like short-term focus, and then you look at an adversary like China who really seems to understand where things are going, the way they're investing in technology. If we talk about like AIs and large language models, some of the best and strongest open source models are coming out of China. Yeah. And that's winning them a lot of influence and goodwill, especially in a time where it feels like the states have become fairly belligerent on the global stage, and that concerns me.
Yeah.
Because like you, again, I'm idealistic, and I have the same thing from my childhood. I wonder what younger generations feel like about the states, but I'm an idealist about the country. Always have been. 9/11, of course, solidified that, because living through that, you saw the response. Mm-hmm. You saw and lived what that was like to see the country unified that way. And so I truly 100% believe that a world where the United States and our values aren't leading is a worse world. Yeah. I think if the Chinese Communist Party is the global hegemon, that's a world that I don't want in comparison to us. That's easy to say when you're the incumbent. Yeah. Right. To be like, everyone else would do a worse job of this, but it's those values that underpin all that. And I am just increasingly concerned that we can't see the forest for the trees in front of us, and China can. Yeah. I don't know if you feel the same way.
No, I think that's true. I also think China is encouraging their companies to not play by the same rules we hold companies to here. Right? We see with some of these AI models that they're releasing that it's stolen intellectual property, repackaged and released. But it comes with a made in China flag, a digital one, but like you sort of get the point, right? Like I worry, right, that there's, historical partners around the world, potential new partners around the world, nations who are making a decision about sort of who do they lean into from a digital consumption perspective. And China's pretty appealing, right? They're less expensive devices, ready to access AI. They don't have to jump through the crazy export regime that U.S. companies have to do in order to get technology. And so, we've created this, unfortunately, this scenario that pretty heavily incentivizes them to not choose the U.S. I think there are some advantages. I think folks are concerned about, especially some of the social capital things that China is doing, really worried about, sort of if you put that technology into your country, right? Like, is China just sort of spying on all your population? Are they going to use that to exploit your population or exploit your government or exploit your natural resources? But when we continue to make it harder, at some point in time, they may decide that the progress and the ability to get that progress from a technical perspective quickly justifies the potential risks down the road. And so I'd love to see, the U.S. sort of lean into our partners around the world more. I'd love to see a real conversation about how to reduce those export burdens. I mean, I've watched Jensen Huang, sort of rail against the export burden recently, but we feel that as Orbis on a sort of more micro level, where every time we want to work with a partner around the world to support them in developing capability or capacity that the U.S. government wants them to have, we got to jump through this crazy export process to provide them technology. Yeah. And I think that's only getting harder, right? Is we're worried about the capabilities of our chips and our AI. We're like locking them down more and more. And it's not a level playing field. And so I think we need to think about, to your point, like sort of strategic long-term investments, because as I travel around the world, as we do work with our customers all over the world, like, people want U.S. technology. Yeah. They just sometimes feel like it's out of reach.
Yeah, that's again, I'm gonna risk getting like not necessarily philosophical, but on my soapbox here, which American greatness, or there's a term they always use, exceptionalism. Yep. Yeah. So much of our historical success, we're not giving enough credit to our history of collaboration and partnership. Use the term partnership and our global partners. Like, what has the American superpower looked like? Yeah, it's been one that has led a coalition of countries like most of the EU, and tight collaboration, long-term collaboration. Yes, there is you could argue in an innate sort of like cultural exceptionalism to America, and I get that. And being like, driven by capitalism and innovation sort of historically, and skepticism about the government, I get all that as part of it. But I think to take on autocratic societies and autocratic nation-state actors, you have to collaborate, and that's what that is what literally historically has defeated those regimes. And every time autocracies seem to take power and take a hold, you do see this shift where I can see here in the States, people will start to argue, well, hey, to keep pace with China, we really got to take away some of this like drag that, democracy creates, right? If we really want to compete with them, maybe we should become a little more autocratic like them. It's like we're gonna have to pick a side. We're either gonna have to go down that path, which is terrible, or we have to lean back into collaboration's a good thing. We have to stop being so belligerent and make friends. Right. Isolation is we're not gonna beat China one-on-one. We're gonna beat China one on many, right? Anyway, this is so boxy. I apologize.
No, I think it's right. And I mean, again, I think I try and find the good, right? Like I see a lot of the investments that are taking place in artificial intelligence, right, with partners around the world, where the U.S. has come up with a regime to sort of allow them to buy chips. It's tightly regulated, very carefully controlled, with an expectation of a lot of oversight. So we've put the burden in place, but we are seeing some momentum there, right? Some nations are buying and building really interesting data centers, and they're going to deploy models, and they're choosing U.S. technology. And so I'm seeing some good there. But I do get into conversations, right, where they're like, oh man, we were this close to going the other direction. And so I'm with you. We got to reduce the drag just a little. It doesn't have to be like totally, guardrails off, but just we should be always in a constant conversation about how do we be more collaborative? How do we be the partner of choice? How do we make sure that US technology that's what everybody wants and they still think it's worth it?
Yeah. Microcosm of that, I talked to a guy, Robert Potter was on the podcast way back now, 2 years ago.
Okay.
He had been in Ukraine for a while. And one of the things we talked about is how the Ukrainians, they don't care where their drones come from, whether it's Chinese or American. They care about the cost and impact. And they've been buying a lot more Chinese drones because we created something that costs $1 million to get up in the sky. They created one that costs 20 grand.
Yeah.
Right. We're making the choice impossible at times, to go with what we're producing. Anyway, I want to get into hot takes. If you have any, cybersecurity hot takes or anything you see that we do as an industry.
Okay, I got a couple then.
Yeah.
When I was at Army Special Operations Command, I had a brilliant signal officer come to me and say, I think we should really lean into the cybersecurity excellence of private industry, right? I think there's a real conversation to be had here about private industry operate security operation centers. They do it really effectively. They think about sort of efficiency and effectiveness, and they are able to move quickly. They're also not stuck in the acquisition process that we are. And it's like, I'm not saying, we lose accountability, right? We'll still have some monitoring, right? We'll still be responsible for the decisions around it. But like, I want to lean into a couple of commercial partners and see if they can provide a level of security, a level of regular insight that we don't have. And it frees up my incredible communicators to focus on the things that only we can do. And so we tried that, I think, to great effect. So I think there's one of my hot takes would be the government often believes it has to be the integrator and has to run the operation center. And I think there's a real opportunity to have a conversation with industry around that. There's been some, I think, interesting executive orders and memos published recently about sort of commercial first. But I think we often sort of think about that in terms of hardware and maybe sort of commercial software, but not in terms of commercial services. And I think there's a really exciting conversation to have about that. And I think, if we can head down that path, you can create some compelling competition.
Yeah.
But I think also put some sunshine on the underinvestment.
The cynical take there, or the immediate sort of response to that when we talk about commercial first is what are the motivations, right? My other world that I live in that I talk about frequently is I'm a paramedic. And generally, if you're in the medical industry, anywhere you see the profit motive as the motivator or the sort of final thing, bad decisions get made. Yeah. Poor care is provided. The best jobs typically in medicine are public funded because there's no financial motivation. There's no demand to do more with less. We're not so hyper focused on efficiency, which is it's an easy sort of response to anything capitalistic.
Right.
What do you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of traps there, right? And I actually think this is a space where, if you just sort of apply it generally, right, we'll go and award some, massive, poorly managed contract, and it's a trap. I agree with that. But I think I think the other side of that coin is that industry is pretty good at being responsive. And if you can set the requirements and measure the performance, both the sort of financial motivation in the short term, but also the long-term financial motivation, right? Like make it relatively easy to cancel these things. And we didn't find it that hard to work with the vendors and hold them accountable. In fact, it was almost the opposite, right? They oftentimes clued us into ways that we could better require them to deliver things they thought would be enhancing. And so I think there are ways to manage it. But I think the second piece is that, it became interesting from a talent perspective, especially in things like cybersecurity, where sometimes, one or two or three incredibly talented people can deliver an outcome that you just couldn't. You couldn't get from 10 or 100 people sitting staring at a screen all day. And so I think this is actually one of those spaces where sometimes we can attract that talent. We can, as we started the podcast, right, talk about serving. But I also think there's some of these folks who they want to work on interesting problems across a bunch of different problem sets. And, they don't want to just sit in an operations center and have this job. They want to work on a bunch of these and find the vulnerabilities. And so things like blue teams and red teams, like I'm really interested in exquisite talent that's sort of fractional in nature. And I don't think there's a non-commercial mechanism to that. At least I haven't found one.
Yeah, no, and I have these conversations sometimes in, we interface with government in the DoD, DOW space, the cybersecurity compliance space. We interface with them a lot, and we have conversations about what the standards should be and things. And oftentimes their default position, the way they approach it, is like the federal government. And I've said, and this is not a unique thing I've said. I've heard it said as well, of like, hey, there's a reason you have private industry. If you constrain us the same way you constrain yourselves, you're going to get the same outcome that you produce, which is like what we're here to answer for, the weakness that we're here to fill. Both sides have a place here. And it's always a balance, I guess. And sometimes the balance gets a little too uncontrolled and then gets way too controlled. And we just have to get better and more dialed in about what makes sense there. Because you don't want unfettered, uncontrolled capitalistic motivations where it's just like, again, profit at any cost, regardless of the impact of that security operations center. They have to be impactful. They have to be actually producing the necessary outcome, but you don't want to be wasteful. You don't want it to be useless. So we always have to kind of find that balance, which is tough.
Yeah, that is tough.
What's your thought on cybersecurity and compliance? You got any hot takes there?
I think compliance is important, right? I think in my younger years as an engineer, I could have gotten on my soapbox and sort of argue that these things aren't helpful, but it's a really important mechanism. But what I think is, especially the government needs to stop moving the timelines. We're not a cybersecurity provider, right? Like, delighted to work with ones who are, but it feels like the timeline for compliance and the requirements for timelines is constantly changing. I feel like we spend an amazing amount of time as the leadership team trying to understand what we are expected to be compliant with. It's not easy. Sometimes I feel like I'm reading the tea leaves. You can deploy capital getting one compliance regime, and then they change the rule book the next day and slide it another 2 years, and you're going to re-spend that money. And it's what we've just decided, right? I think to your point on sometimes we're going through the compliance regimes on a regular basis because that's the best way to make sure we truly understand the risk. And I think that's the right thing to do. But I appreciate we're in an incredibly fortunate position as a company, and that if you're a really small company sort of trying to get your very first government contract, you're already dealing with things like facility clearances and registration and all the things that a company has to do. And to look at the cost of compliance, that is a massive bar we're asking people to jump over. And I'm not sure that sort of constantly moving timelines is advantageous as picking a compliance standard and driving it. I'm optimistic, right? I think CMMC 2.0 feels like we're finally sort of sticking to a timeline. The message has been cleared. We've had the standard for sort of 2 years. So that's a good example of one. I think the other thing that I would say is there's too many of them. Between CMMC and then as we look overseas, some of the ISO 27001, Cyber Essentials Plus in the UK. It's it's a Venn diagram. There's a lot of overlaps here, but I have to pay for the compliance process for each one of them. And there's not really reciprocity or a common standard around it. And I think that's a space where we could really advantage people's desire to participate if we could find some consistency.
You ever seen that XKCD comic where it's like there are 14 compliance frameworks and like they're criticizing it and they're like there are now 15 different frameworks there? Which is sometimes how it feels like we at our company, because we're trying to orient to multiple frameworks. We're very heavily focused on the CMMC side, but long term our vision is we want to be a provider outside of just this narrow space. So we're starting the process now to try to orient to that. And like the immediate trap is, I guess we have to create a meta framework to tie all these things together. And so you end up spending up all this time and effort and thought on, just another arbitrary set of requirements that we're defining that won't map to anybody really but us. But it's a hard problem to solve for. And then, you brought up CMMC, which, yes, the timelines they're finally here, right? It's actually happening 8 years later.
Yes.
But one of my key criticisms here is the cybersecurity standard that we're implementing is like a 2014, 2016 timeframe standard.
Yeah, it's a low bar.
In a time where, like, as we've established, it's getting harder and harder to defend. The attack surface is changing. And the way we have incentivized defense contractors to build cybersecurity programs is around a data confidentiality standard that's almost a decade old, that says nothing about modern technology.
Yeah.
AI, what's that? Like, where is that addressed? And the speed of iteration here, which I know you can relate to being on the government side and the bureaucracy and the acquisition cycle, that's not tenable for this to be successful.
Yeah, right.
It can't take 8 years to get 1,000 companies to pass a standard. And that's where we're at. That's a little over 1,000 companies have passed this certification regime. I'm with you. Like, compliance is a good thing. One of the common criticisms of people like me who criticize it is you just don't want to show your work. I'm like, younger me, totally true.
Yeah,
100%.
Right.
I didn't want to show my work. But I also was like anti-Microsoft and all that, because like when you're a young, edgy sysadmin, you're like Linux everything, that sort of thing. And
that's right. Sudo all the time.
Right, exactly. Hey,
my finger's my safety.
Dude, the number of bad decisions I can think that I made
totally
in my career where I'm like, man, I'm glad that actors weren't that sophisticated back then. But it's not that we don't want to show our work. It's that stop making it so burdensome to do good security. Let us spend more time on the security piece. The compliance piece, one of the novel things I think can happen, there's a great opportunity in the compliance space to converge these a bit stronger and make it less of a exercise where one team works on the security side and then one team goes and checks the work. You can make that more seamless and make it less labor intensive to do the compliance thing. But we really have to tighten this timeline. I think we really have to minimize the scope a bit and focus on principles. You made a great point. Stop producing 900 rows of spreadsheet and just ask 14 questions. You know what those 14 questions probably answered for? 95% of what is captured in those rows anyway.
Right.
But you're probably still going to have more confidence at the end of it. You're going to have had a better long-term impact, more influence. So you can have that conversation 1,000 times in a year versus how long does it take to produce that spreadsheet?
Yeah.
Can you produce 3-4 of those a year? We just really have to be smarter. How else can I say that?
Yeah, no, I think smarter. I also think I think more predictable, right? I think there's a world here where, to your point, we haven't updated the standard in a pretty long time. But if we put out the schedule, actually started to move on it and said every 3 years, right, we're going to evolve this.
The crazy thing,
a planning perspective, we can plan for it.
There's a newer version of that standard
already.
But that's the crazy thing.
Great.
It takes so long. That publication's been out for probably 2 years.
Yeah.
But we can't adopt it because the bureaucratic levers codified the old version.
That's right.
And so we still have to go through a whole cycle where literally companies are certifying today. Right now, there are companies certifying on an old standard that we can't adopt. And I always tell people, this is the defense industry. This is who you think in all the Hollywood movies are the most sophisticated, highest tech, fastest movers. No.
Yeah.
Shockingly so. Unnervingly so, where you're like, man, as we're gearing up and the geopolitical tensions are rising, the fact that we're moving so slow is alarming.
Yeah, I think that's right.
We need to create better incentive structure. But anyway, I was asking you about your hot takes, and I'm over here giving mine.
No, it's good. I like that one. I think that's. I actually agree. I I think the last one is we need to throw out the entire export regime and start over. Something that was built to prevent the export of nuclear technology shortly after the end of World War II is not capable of being applied thoughtfully to modern day hardware and especially modern day software. So AI in particular, it just doesn't, it falls down. And it seems wild to me. I understood when it was applied to sort of nuclear weapons why you were really worried about whether or not it was, a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, an intelligence organization, or a defense client. But today, the fact that if the name says defense, it's a significantly higher bar than if it's someone else. Like, you've created a really perverse incentive. It's not that the technology is not being exported. It just makes it materially harder to work with the U.S. So throw it out, start over, and think about it today with the technologies that we're worried about exporting.
Is the key challenge there that it makes it so onerous to work with the people that we want to work with?
It makes it really onerous for us to work with customers that we want to work with. It also means that they often don't believe that a U.S. company is going to be able to deliver outcomes for them, right? They sign a contract, you apply for an export license, it takes 30, 60, 90 or longer days to get approved, and often comes with riders that says things like, you may integrate this, but you may not connect it to any weapon system. And there's no defense organization on planet Earth who's interested in that. Yeah. And so, so they turn around and they go buy the same solution from China.
So what does a better export control regime look like if you're in charge of it for a day?
Yeah, I mean, I would probably take a real step back to think about what is it that we're worried about losing. Like today, I think the pretty significant concern is the advantages that we have around chipsets and the advantages we have around a very specific set of models. Like, let's regulate that. Let's focus on those sorts of things. I think we're probably still worried about things like warheads, and still worried about things like flight control systems. And so, write the regime around those. But I think it should be less about the end user and more about the technology specifically. And I think we should put some pretty clear guardrails around that and remove a lot of the burden. Today, which would write a massive amount of paperwork to deliver encryption to any partner anywhere in the world, including the open source standards who've been out there for 50 years. AES, right? Like, why am I explaining to you? Like, they can just download it themselves, right? It just happens to be integrated. Like, what are we trying to stop there? I understood when you were worried about the crypto of a flight control system. We should still control the things that are like specifically implemented in that way. But I think it's less about the foundational technology. Like, if I were to reduce it never considered the idea of open source. So like, if they can download it, we should be able to provide it. That shouldn't be regulated. Yeah. And it seems really sensible. It's quite hard, especially today in the way like the ITAR export regime works.
Yeah. I think there's like a story that I've heard, like PGP. The guy that created PGP like got in trouble because I think he did something like he put it like a T-shirt to like get it out of the country. Yeah. And like, you exported it.
Right.
It's like, it's pretty ridiculous, all said. But yeah, super things that we make onerous, especially in a time. The theme here is like, the world is changing, but we need to keep pace. We need to innovate. We need to let America do what America does best, innovate. Yes. And we have to start breaking down these onerous bureaucratic processes that really stymie it. Yes. And we need to create incentives to do it the right way. Yeah. Not just we want to compete because there's an economic benefit, but because we want to maintain, we want to maintain American hegemony. But we do.
Yeah, or at least tech dominance.
Yeah, maybe not hegemony is the word there. Yeah. Well, we've covered a lot of ground, Tim. And the tradition here, we've already talked a bit about optimism, but the tradition here is that we end on notes of optimism. Okay. I'm an optimistic person, as I said. I find everyone that sits across from me tends to be as well. And I always like to know, like, where do you find it? Where does your optimism come from? If you think about where is that rooted or where you tap into to get that optimism day to day, where are you getting it?
Yeah, so I think you started with one that does really have me optimistic, which is as I talk to a lot of my peers, my contemporaries, our partners, like I feel like there's this bunch of folks who have self-determined that making decisions for the right reason, the morality, the ethics, like it matters, and they're driving that through their decisions by choice. And so that I'm still really optimistic about the American spirit and the folks that I'm delighted to work alongside. I talk to young people on a pretty regular basis, who are thinking about, I shouldn't just say young people, I talk to people on a regular basis who are thinking about government service. And I still love that they're people who want to serve, who believe they can make the world a better place, the country a better place, the services that America provides to Americans and the ones that we provide around the world better. And just the belief that they're willing to try like that, I think is really, it gives me optimism. And yeah, I think I'm pretty optimistic that, even as there's sort of conflicts ongoing around the world, like we see, despite some of the isolationism, despite some of the confused messaging, despite some of the strategic ambiguity, like partnerships continue to work. It works at the human level. I think the systems have largely, there's some systems that are working, things like NATO, but some of the systems have broken down, but the relationships, and again, right, I got to work alongside soldiers who'd been deployed all over the world, like deep personal relationships and that connective tissue, still one of, I think, America's distinct advantages. And so that leaves me optimistic about where we're headed from a national security perspective.
Hell yeah. Tim Van Dam, where can the people find you?
Orbis Operations, Orbis Operations or orbisops.com. Would be delighted to have a conversation anytime.
Hell yeah. All right, man. Well, we appreciate it.
Thanks, brother.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Watchers. For more great content, be sure to like, subscribe, and check out our channel. We'll see you on the next one.